Why banks stopped fearing failure. Failure once meant disappearance. A closed door, a wiped out balance sheet, a lesson burned permanently into institutional memory. Today, failure feels different, managed, absorbed, and often expected. To understand why banks stopped fearing failure, we need to return to a time when consequences were immediate and personal. Early banking systems operated without guarantees. Mistakes led to collapse. Confidence was fragile, and survival depended on restraint. Risk was weighed carefully because the cost of being wrong was final. Over time, that reality changed. Safety nets were introduced to prevent systemic collapse. Deposit protection reassured the public. Emergency lending provided backstops during stress. Each reform was rational, even necessary. Together, they transformed how failure was experienced, not eliminated, but softened. As protections expanded, behavior adjusted. Banks learned that not all losses were fatal. Distress could be managed. Liquidity could be supplied. Mergers could absorb weakness. The system became less punishing, and with that shift, fear began to fade. Risk no longer carried the same existential weight. This altered decision-making at its core. Strategies expanded within permitted boundaries. Leverage felt manageable. Growth became safer than contraction. Failure was no longer an endpoint. It was a phase, often followed by recovery or rescue. The incentive structure changed quietly but profoundly. Markets reinforced the shift. Institutions perceived as critical attracted confidence even during stress. Investors assumed intervention would arrive if needed. Funding costs reflected expectation of support. The line between strength and importance blurred, and size itself began to signal safety. Regulators faced a delicate balance. Preventing collapse was essential, but doing so reshaped expectations. Each successful intervention reduced fear of the next failure. Stability improved, but discipline weakened. The system learned that survival no longer depended solely on caution. Early signs appeared subtly. Risk-taking increased without corresponding anxiety. Losses were framed as manageable setbacks. The language around failure softened. What once demanded humility now invited confidence. This was the opening shift. Banks did not become reckless overnight. They became comfortable. And when fear fades from a system built to manage risk, something fundamental changes. Because fear, when calibrated correctly, is not weakness. It is memory. And forgetting it has consequences. As fear receded, incentives realigned in subtle but powerful ways. Risk was no longer evaluated through the lens of survival, but through optimization. Decisions focused on return potential within regulatory limits, not on existential threat. The system did not abandon caution. It redefined it. Institutions learned how to operate close to the edge without crossing it. Models quantified loss tolerance. Capital buffers provided reassurance. Emergency mechanisms existed in the background, rarely discussed but deeply understood. Failure became something to manage, not something to avoid at all costs. This shift altered culture. Success was measured by growth, not durability. Expansion felt safer than contraction, because contraction signaled weakness while growth signaled relevance. Banks pursued scale, believing that importance itself reduced risk. The larger the institution, the more confident it became in its ability to endure stress. Markets reinforced these beliefs. Investors treated large institutions differently from small ones. Funding remained accessible even during turbulence. Price reactions to bad news were often muted by expectations of support. The system learned that failure, if it came, would be shared. Regulators faced the consequences of their own success. By preventing collapse, they reduced fear, but fear had once enforced discipline. Interventions were designed to protect the system, not individual firms, yet expectations blurred. The distinction between stabilization and rescue grew thin. Early warning signs appeared in behavior rather than balance sheets. Leverage increased gradually. Complexity expanded. Risk migrated into structures designed to remain within rules while stretching assumptions. Nothing broke. Nothing alarmed. Comfort grew. Public perception followed outcomes. Banks appeared resilient. Crises seemed containable. The idea that failure could be permanent faded from memory. Confidence replaced caution not through ignorance, but through experience of repeated rescue. This was the deeper transformation. A system designed to prevent catastrophe began teaching participants that catastrophe was unlikely. Fear, once a regulator in its own right, was quietly removed from the equation. And when fear disappears from decision-making, it does not leave a vacuum. It is replaced by belief in models, in safeguards, and in the assumption that someone else will step in if things go wrong. The conflict emerges when a system built without fear encounters stress that cannot be easily absorbed. Losses appear simultaneously across institutions that believe themselves protected by scale and structure. Confidence wavers, not because safeguards fail, but because their limits become visible. Banks react quickly, but predictably. Exposure is reduced in similar ways. Assets are sold into the same markets. Liquidity tightens as everyone moves at once. The absence of fear has produced alignment, and alignment turns caution into amplification. Risk management frameworks struggle under this pressure. Models assume orderly adjustment. Reality delivers synchronized retreat. Buffers absorb initial losses, but they do not restore confidence. The system remains solvent, yet unstable, caught between belief in protection and evidence of strain. Markets sense the contradiction. Prices move sharply despite assurances of stability. Volatility rises without clear collapse. Investors question not whether banks will survive, but how often survival will require intervention. The cost of comfort becomes harder to ignore. Regulators face a narrowing set of options. Intervening confirms expectations of support, reinforcing the very behavior that created vulnerability. Standing back risks allowing alignment to deepen into disorder. Each choice shapes future incentives, not just present outcomes. Public trust erodes quietly, not through panic, but through realization. If failure no longer teaches lessons, what does? If consequences are softened, what restrains excess? The system appears stable, yet increasingly dependent on external reassurance. This is the moment fear would once have intervened, not as panic, but as restraint. Its absence leaves the system relying on rules and rescue alone. And rules cannot adapt instantly, while rescue cannot arrive without consequence. The conflict is no longer about preventing failure. It is about whether a system that no longer fears failure can regulate itself when conditions change. Because fear, when present, limits behavior. When removed, it shifts that burden onto oversight, and oversight can never move as fast as belief. The reckoning arrives when the system recognizes that protection has a price. Failure was softened to preserve stability, but in doing so, it altered behavior in ways that made stability harder to maintain. Safety nets held, but they also reshaped incentives far beyond their original purpose. In the aftermath, policymakers reassess the balance. Support mechanisms remain essential, but their use becomes more conditional. Intervention is paired with consequences designed to restore discipline. The goal shifts from eliminating fear to calibrating it, ensuring that protection does not erase accountability. Institutions adapt cautiously. Risk management expands beyond regulatory thresholds into behavioral awareness. Growth strategies are reevaluated. The idea that size guarantees safety weakens. Durability regains importance alongside relevance. Fear returns, not as panic, but as respect for uncertainty. Markets respond with adjustment. Funding costs better reflect risk. Expectations of rescue become less automatic. Confidence returns, but it is tempered by recognition that support is not limitless. Stability feels earned rather than assumed. For the public, trust rebuilds slowly, not because failure is impossible, but because consequences feel more balanced. The system appears less comforting, but more credible. Transparency replaces reassurance. Awareness replaces illusion. Looking back, the era when banks stopped fearing failure reveals a deep truth. Stability cannot be sustained by removing fear entirely. Fear, when properly aligned, enforces discipline that no rule can fully replicate. The challenge is not to return fragility, but to preserve memory, to design systems where failure is survivable but not forgettable, where protection exists but does not eliminate responsibility. Because when fear disappears completely, risk does not vanish with it. It simply waits for conditions that rules and rescue cannot control. Subscribe to join the journey. Why?